Greetings, everyone. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to another episode of Friday Morning at the Fun House alongside, guess who? Mr. Martin Popoff. What's going on, Martin?
Yes. And the Guess Who is touring again,
That's
apparently, right?
right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Just talking
100%.
about, get someone to interview these guys, right?
I was like, cool, Randy Bachman. Like, Randy Bachman's not even included in it. It's like,
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah. And speaking of Canadians, I got to interview Lawrence Gowan from Styx the other day, which was
Very
really
cool.
cool. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
I've seen a couple interviews with him. He seems like a very engaging guy.
yeah. I was looking him up on Wikipedia too. I knew A Criminal Mind was a big song, but I mean, it looks like he had three multi-platinum albums in Canada. Which isn't a lot, but still, it's pretty good. So he had quite a career. And first thing he said to me is, "Well, oh yeah, Styx, we're playing all the time. We're playing through to November, etc." And he says, "But I've got a 9-city Gowan tour coming up as well. And he's going to play Massey Hall here in Toronto and stuff. So
That's
yeah,
very cool.
pretty wild."
Now, without giving too much away, did he hint at all about Styx making another album? Did he say
No,
anything?
I never really got into that.
Yeah.
But I got some good stuff out of him on every time I talk to Sticks, I seem like I want to hammer them on this term pump rock and Midwest rock, right? And he had good answers for both of those.
Oh, really?
The best of all the guys. So you could tell he's a good musicologist guy. I was thinking, hey, he's kind of a guy who could have his own YouTube show and obviously talk about music, which is pretty cool. And the funny thing that happened was, I'm interviewing him. He's sitting in his hotel room in, I think it was Clearwater, Florida, and he's like drying his shirts on the balcony, and you could see the door open and all this stuff. We're talking about keyboards and stuff, and he tilts his camera down, and he goes, "Oh, I got a keyboard right in front of me." He plays a little bit of Yes, Heart of the Sunrise, right? And it's what was funny about that is and I had a good laugh. Is like you tilt your camera down, and you don't see a computer keyboard. You see an actual keyboard right there, right? So,
You didn't expect that at all, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
that was kind of cool. So, yeah.
Yeah, I like those kind of like on the fly things like that. Have had that happen. I remember like years ago, I was interviewing Andy Powell from Wishbone Ash, and we were just talking about whatever, and then I don't know, I mentioned something about guitars or whatever. He goes, "Oh, hold on a second," and he goes and he grabs like a cool guitar that's like literally right there, and he just starts and plays a couple licks, whatever. And it's like, "Oh, back to the interview," and it's like, "Oh, that sounds cool, right?" Just
Yeah,
kind of impromptu, you know. So
yeah,
as opposed to the ones that just sit there and like just talk at you for like a half
yeah,
hour, and
yeah,
it's like all right, so that's cool, that's cool.
yeah.
So we have speaking of cool, we have a cool show for you here today. So many of you who follow the channel for a while know I've done sporadically over the years this kind of show called Forgotten Favorites, and generally in Forgotten Favorites I tend to talk about bands that are kind of like fall way under the radar, fairly obscure. And a lot of times when I talk about forgotten favorites and all these kind of more obscure rarities and things like that, this whole topic of proto-metal comes up. And Martin and I talk a lot about the more famous metal bands, and especially some of the early metal bands. And but there's this whole idea of proto-metal, these bands who kind of came before or at the same time that were way less recognized, very, very underground. And in some instances, maybe they released one album or they recorded some stuff and never got officially released. They had a demo, and then years and years later, you see these albums and CDs coming out of these heavy bands that like nobody ever heard of from like 1969, 1970, 1971, so on and so forth. So Martin and I were talking, we figured, well, why don't we maybe do like an episode or two on some of these proto-metal bands and albums. So we're going to kind of call this a deep dive into proto-metal. And like I said, you'll probably get at least 2 episodes out of this. We'll maybe do one again in a couple of weeks or whatever. And so for this particular one, Martin and I have picked out 5 bands each and an album, right, to talk about that kind of really exemplify what we're talking about here, proto-metal. So proto-metal, pre-metal, there was no such thing as metal, but these kind of odd heavy bands that came around in a time where there really wasn't a lot of heavy music. So the big bands, which Sabbath and Budgie and Purple and Zeppelin and Uriah Heep and blah blah blah, we talked about them quite a bit, right? Those are the ones that got noticed, but there were other bands simmering way below the surface. Martin, I don't know if you want to add a little bit to all that.
Yeah, so there were a lot of them, and a lot of them seemed to be one album or two album or three album bands, or as you mentioned, over the years we've seen a lot of unearthing of garage tapes and basement tapes and demos and shelved albums that have come out as well over time. The funny thing is, every time I sort of think about um, a topic like this, it's like I don't have a lot of this in my head because a couple of things. So number one, I ended up doing this book, which is a 70s review guide, and importantly, in the back of it, I've got some lists, and one of them I've got my top 100 favorite albums of the 70s, top 100 heaviest albums of the 70s, top 100 heaviest obscurities of the 70s, and top 100 favorite obscurities of the 70s, right? So I've got that as a little bit of a cheat note, and I went to it to basically come up with this. And I noticed in my heaviest obscurities list, I didn't put dates in the back in the appendix, so it was neat going and checking the dates, and I learned a few things, about my relationship with these albums as I went as well. And part of that relationship relates to my very latest podcast episode, which was 199. Why is this depressing? And it goes to that thing of this old jammy psych sort of stuff being sort of depressing, and I'm never really into a lot of these different bands, and this speaks to that episode we did about how you gravitate to the early 70s and me to the late 70s quite often. But yeah, so the idea here, we're gonna go through five each and what they represent, sort of thing. So the first one, and forgive me, I might have to cheat a little here and quote from myself in some of these things, but so I'm gonna go in chronological order. So yeah, as you mentioned, I mean, the big ones, we know we have this frame, and something that's always stuck in my mind is that the true massive invention of heavy metal. And then this also brings up a lot of this sort of stuff too, the Who Invented Heavy Metal book, which looks at all the little bits and pieces of guitar distortion and wah-wah and vocal fry and songs and albums with two or three heavy songs and just the timing as we go along. But the whole idea here is these are full albums as well, right? So these are bands represented by that. So my first choice is High Tide Sea Shanties. This is one people talk about a lot. It's got this really cool album cover, which kind of looks like, if I think in my mind, it reminds me of a little bit of Sir Lord Baltimore, Kingdom Come. It's got like an illustration, dramatic illustration. But this is a funny one because it is 1969, so it is before the big four, which is Sabbath 1, Sabbath 2, Very Heavy, Very Humble, and In Rock. This is around the time of Stooges and MC5. But the idea here is that what you've got is Tony Hill, ex Misunderstood. But the big sort of semi-famous guy here is Simon House, violinist who ends up in Hawkwind and I think David Bowie. So what you have here is almost like a blueprint for Hawkwind, because Hawkwind was not heavy on their first album. They got a little heavier later on, and they had this blanga term, which is this idea of just this storming, punky, heavy rock that gets you in kind of like a raga hypnotic state sort of thing.
Very repetitive riffing, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And High Tide Sea Shanties is like that. So what makes it heavy, of course, has to be distorted guitar, and that's there. But also just having Simon House in there as a radical violinist oddly makes this a sort of heavy album as well. So it's funny. In this book, every single album I reviewed, I gave it a heaviness rating and a what I like when I how much I like it rating. And at the time when I wrote this book, which is over 10 years ago now, I gave it an 8 for heaviness and an 8 for liking it. And then they had a follow-up, and that's it, a self-titled in 70, both are on Liberty Records, which I gave a 5 for heaviness and an 8. So they dropped off. And that's the other thing I've noticed with a lot of these bands is a lot of them try heaviness and they drop off on the next album, and they realize it's not very commercial at the time, right? So they're finding out that this is not a very fashionable form of music, and all sorts of label and management pressure probably comes down on them. You think of Bang with Bang Music, right? a lot of these bands just abandon the heaviness sort of thing. So you know, credit to the ones that stuck with it. It all worked out for them, and they all got pretty famous at it, right? But yeah, none of these bands sort of did. But yeah, so this is, and it has very the song titles are hilarious on here. You've got Fun List's Lament, Death Warmed Up, Pushed but Not Forgotten, yeah, Pushed but Not Forgotten, Walking Down Their Outlook, and Missing Out, and Nowhere. So yeah, it's just very jammy, wall of sound, but for 69 it is pretty heavy, and like I say, it's kind of where Hawkwind went later on. And you know, all the proto-metal musicologist lovers of this kind of music like this album, and it's just kind of cool having the name of the band High Tide and having this thing called sea shanties, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's my first choice.
I really like that album a lot. It's very good. Yeah, and it's funny how the rest of their catalog is kind of like less heavy.
Yeah.
I'll have one of those examples as well coming up in a little bit. But yeah, it's a very, very good choice. Good choice. You know what's really interesting too about this? It's like, you know, all these bands that we're going to talk about are pretty damn obscure. And, you know, no one was buying or really listening to this stuff at the time. But yet it's funny how in the ensuing years, you see quotes from younger bands who are like, oh, yeah, one of our biggest influences was High Tide. And you're like, really? How the hell did that happen? Right? You see that all the time. It's like, you know, like Leaf Hound. This is a perfect example. We're not going to talk about them today, but Leaf Hound is a really obscure band from the very early 70s. And I can't tell you how many times over the years I've heard other bands talk about how important Leaf Hound was in the creation of their own style and sound. It's just really weird how that works out, right? Anyway, so my first choice is a band from Scotland. No, we're not talking about Nazareth, right? Because that's the band that everybody always talks about when you talk about heavy bands from Scotland. This was a band who were together between 1969 and 1974, never released any official albums at the time, made a whole bunch of demo recordings, although. And in 2009, a label called Vintage Rockadome, I guess, Rockadome, released the self-titled Iron Claw album, which is comprised of 16 tracks, all demo recordings that came from that time period that they were together. This is raw as hell. Obviously, you know, if you look at the front and the back cover, right, the guys obviously were really into Black Sabbath, and with songs like Skull Crusher and Cross Rocker and Claustrophobia, right? Not claustrophobia like you would normally spell it, but claws like claw, iron claw. Big, huge, heavy riffs, slight psych edge, couple tracks are more kind of like heavy blues rock. But man, you got screaming wah-wah guitar solos. Martin was mentioning a lot of these elements that you're going to see pop up throughout a lot of these elements. Wah-wah, feedback, fuzz, distortion. You know, there's like big, heavy Brontosaurus rock on the song Winter. Again, if you like Budgie, if you like early Blue Cheer, Sabotage, the one song in here kind of sounds like Cream. The vocals are really good. They're kind of low in the mix. They have kind of like this hazy stoner feel to them. If you're familiar with a lot of the stoner rock bands of more modern times. So this is like a really cool discovery, because I think if people really like kind of raw, underproduced, really heavy and psychedelic music like this, I think this will be a really cool discovery. A lot of really good songs. You know, 16 tracks might sound like a lot, but there's plenty to love here. I only mentioned a couple of them, but there's, you know, Pavement Artist is another good one. Like I said, Let It Grow is really good. Lots of fuzz on that song. But I think if you really want to hear what this band is all about, go ahead and look up a song called Skull Crusher. That's probably my favorite song on the album. Really good. So, but you really can't go wrong with this album. Very cool stuff. And again, they would have some kind of reunions over the years sporadically, but nothing ever really stuck. And I think in 2013 they did like one last show, and that's the last we ever heard from them. So it's already a decade ago. But raw as all hell, but that's kind of the charm of this. So if you like that kind of really, this is like really underground. Martin, this is so far underground that it's below the water table underneath the bottom of my property. That's how underground this is. But yeah, Iron Claw, self-titled. They also have another couple of compilations that have come out, but this is by far the best one. So this will give you most of their recordings. So There you go, my first one.
Yeah, it's interesting. On those, I was always adamant with that reviews book that I wasn't going to put in stuff that didn't officially come out at the time, because you always wonder that if the label got a hold of them, right, or if they got signed and would they say, oh, you got to add some acoustic guitar and flute to this, right? Oh, let's put a horn arrangement on this, right? And all of a sudden, it's not as heavy, right?
Right, right.
So yeah. Yeah, it's really cool that this stuff gets unearthed. So my next choice is Harry Chapter, Can't Get Through. I'll just read a little bit about this because there's some names here, right? So it's so after two scroungy, less professional records, 69's Electric Sounds for Dancing and 70's Eyes, Harry Chapter, or because there's two Aries in the band, created their last album, their masterpiece, Can't Get Through, blasting a heavy, nervy prog alloy to bits, highly electric production and screeching cymbals matching screeching guitar licks for licks. As we go on, like Amon Dual smack chain link clanging against Armageddon or Spontaneous Combustion, hotshot producer Dieter Dierks. So this is Dieter Dierks back then, drenching the guitars in power to the point of harsh psych, while singer Harry Unti wailed away in the background. So the point with this, I found this kind of interesting about some of these where it's like I was listening to them going, damn, the big influence on a lot of these bands early on is not Sabbath and is not the Deep Purple of Mark II. It's like the Deep Purple of Mark I and Iron Butterfly and Steppenwolf. Right. There's a lot of organ going throughout these things. So it's almost like over in Europe on the mainland, and you notice this in the new wave of British heavy metal and in Prague, they seem to be always culturally about a year or two behind. So they haven't really caught up with the Western sounds completely. So what you get with some of these, so this is 71, it's pretty late, right? But they're still sounding like 1968 and 1969, and a lot of organ and a lot of jamming and musicianship, and it's pretty frantic. That's the kind of cool thing about this album. It is frantic and pretty relentlessly heavy. It's a little krautrock, so you get a lot of surprises with it as well. It's got a really cool album cover. At the time when I wrote that book, I rated it a 7 on heaviness and a 9 on how much I liked it. So obviously I was really into it. I guess it's got just like one mellow song on it, which is the shortest one. Really nightmarish though. As we crossed over, it was called. But yeah, so this is going to be a theme on a couple more from my list. Yeah, actually, well, okay. Hang on, how many do we got? Yeah, it's actually 2 more from my list of very much like this. But yeah, I really like this whole krautrock thing, which obviously gave birth to the transition of our Scorpions from Lonesome Crow over to Fly to the Rainbow, which are both still basically krautrock albums. Then you get to In Trance, and it's still kind of a bit krautrocky, right? Which is prog, dark heaviness. And a little bit again, you can work into a little bit of the legacy or inspiration of the idea of Vertigo Records bands, right? True. Which is proggy and dark and heavy and just that crossover. It's like Sabbath was kind of considered a prog band a little bit for that first record, right?
Yeah.
Anything underground band or acid rock band, right?
Acid rock, right? Yeah, with all that kind of avant-garde and experimentation going on. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I've never heard that album. I need to check that out immediately. This kind of stuff is totally in my wheelhouse. So that's, whenever I hear a band that's from this era that kind of played in this kind of scene and I've never listened to them before, I'm like, ooh, that's my assignment for tonight, right? So all right. And you mentioned like the influences on some of these bands, and you're 100% correct. And I would say, like, also for me, on some of the ones that I'm going to talk about, especially for some of the European bands, the influence of Cream also is pretty high. You can hear Cream and certainly Blue Cheer as well. And you're going to hear that on my next choice, which is from 1971. I'm going to go to Switzerland for the band called Toad, self-titled debut. And that's them on the back there.
Yep.
This is absolutely killer. So in addition to Cream, and again, 71, so it's right around the same time as Budgie hitting. If you like Budgie, you'll love this sort of stuff. And I hear a lot of Mountain in this band as well. And of course, Leslie Weston Mountain had already been around for a couple of years by the time this comes out. This album is engineered by Martin Birch. Okay, very early on, one of the early things that he worked on. It's basically guitar, bass, and drums, and a separate singer. The guitar player is this guy named Vic Vergeet, who is just an absolutely killer player. There's some great songs on here. The opening song, Cottonwood Music, is just a barnstorming, riff-laden corker of a track. You know, it's got these really busy drums, explosive guitar solos, big heavy riffing. You got songs like A Life That Ain't Worth Living, which is, again, kind of like a heavier Cream. It's kind of riffy, but there's lots of like lead guitar solos and bass solos, right? There's the jammy thing is very prevalent in here. You got a song like Tank, which is all instrumental and kind of psychedelic, and maybe has a little bit of that kind of krautrock thing going on there as well. You got some bluesier rockers. You got some like doomy Sabbath type things, which is, Life Goes On is totally that. It's like 11 minutes long, so it mixes like early doom and psych all into one song. You got the more fury, and you mentioned frantic before. There's certainly some frantic stuff on here. Pig's Walk is, furious, fast, lots of guitar riffage going on. Kind of reminds me a little bit of Sir Lord Baltimore as well. But these guys released 2 more albums after this before the middle of the decade. But like you mentioned before, a lot of these bands started off really heavy and then kind of tailed away pretty quickly. The other 2 albums that came after this are good. They don't come anywhere near the heaviness of this album. They kind of popped up again in the 90s and the 2000s, but nothing really ever kind of came of that. They might have an album or 2 since then, but this is by far their best, their heaviest. And again, it's from right in that wheelhouse, 1971. So if you haven't heard Toad, self-titled, I highly recommend it.
Yeah. So Vic Vergeet, I can picture that purple album cover down to the bone. So he was a guy that showed up around the new wave of British heavy metal, and it wasn't that great an album. It kind of reminds me of Gary Moore from that era, right? So he showed up later again, and so this is one. It's funny. I've got on my other computer. I've got my list of my top, the top heavy obscurities. I think it's that one. Anyway, so in my notes, I had this as number 57 in terms of heaviness for obscurities, and I had it at a 7.7 in the book. So liked it, but wasn't crazy about it. Then I had the next one as a 7.8. So I guess I thought it was about as heavy, and I liked it even a little more. But the last one I had as a 4.4, which is the big drop off, evidently, right?
I think their second album, I think, has more like kind of prog influences. It's pretty rocking, not quite as much for me as the first one, but I think the first one is a little more kind of like brutish, right? There's just this kind of like lumbering ness about it. Lumberingness, is that even a word? I don't know. But the second album seems a little more sophisticated to me, but it still rocks pretty well. But I would say the first 2 albums are by far their best.
Yeah. And I like the Cream reference too, because Cream is such a throughput, right? Because you get to, obviously, we've talked about this, about how the American response to the big heavy metal stuff wasn't that impressive. It was still kind of stodgy and old, based in a combination of the British blues boom and Cream being kind of the heavy end of the British blues boom and the power trio thing. So yeah, so your Mountain and your Cactuses were not as cool as Sabbath and Heap and all that. And then on the way, you got the Irish band Skid Row, right?
Yeah, true.
Which Phil Lynott was in and out of a little bit, right?
Yep.
And they were on CBS, Gary Moore, and they were almost like Cream crossed with King Crimson. It was like kind of frantic. Again, that word frantic comes up, right? Yeah. That activity, that energy is what's making some of these pretty heavy, right? Okay, so my next choice is quite a different sounding band. 3-Man Army, A Third of a Lifetime, which is actually their debut on Kama Sutra Records, 1971. So again, kind of late.
Keep talking, Martin. I'm going to go grab it.
Okay. All right. So yeah, the idea here is this is the Gurvitz brothers, Adrian and Paul. Remember, there was Gunn, and Gunn is famous for Race with the Devil. Right. Race with the Devil was a pretty heavy song on the first Gun album. It had that really heavy album cover. And then Judas Priest covered Race with the Devil. Didn't come out on any album. Wasn't even that great a version, but it was kind of a Priesty song, which is kind of cool. And then Gun had that album called Gunsight. Yeah, that's kind of a different cover. Yeah, they're all of these are different. You got Third of a Lifetime?
Yep, that's here. I got them all.
Yeah, there we go. So that's the That's I get probably the only cover of it. But yeah, the interesting thing here is that Adrian, the Gurvitz brothers made a lot of good music, right? So there was the Parrish and Gurvitz album as well, and then there was the Baker Gurvitz Army, where he gets together with Ginger Baker, and there's some good heavy stuff there, and
There
some good
totally
guitar
is.
work.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this always reminded me of, what is that album that Mick Abrams, Blodwyn Pig with the 1-0. It reminds me a little bit of that, and Wild Turkey, and what was he? Oh, it's a little proggier, but Fields, that whole time where you got, so on my list of 5, this is actually the most professional album, I think. And it's not krautrocky, it's not old psyche, it's more like not incredibly heavy. I rated it a 7.9, so evidently I really liked it quite a bit. The second one too, I rated a 5.8, so I like that as well. But let me see if I can find a quote from here from my review. Sound of Three Man Army: solid, complicated, riffy hard rock with prog aspirations, licks firing up then dressing up, passage leading to passage, solos and twin leads wildly careening everywhere, the blues leading to pure metal, garagey hard rock, and back to folk and funk. So there's a lot going on in this, but it was well recorded. The guitar work was really thoughtful. There were a lot of riffs in a lot of different directions, but generally you could tell that they liked the aggressiveness and heaviness of guitars. But it was soberly recorded, conservatively recorded, just well put together. Let's see. It's mostly quite loud and metallic, with lots of note dense flights of fancy, a plethora of instrumental breaks, caterwauling squalls of sound, a general old school preschool shred. Recommended on all fronts: the production, the playing, the singing, the creativity, fairly insistent heaviness, no doubt resulting in the band's collectible semi-legendary status. After 4 albums, the band lost Tony Newman to David Bowie. So here we got the Simon House story all over again. So yeah, like I say, even the Baker Gurvitz Army stuff was, they're almost like a heavy prog band, those guys.
Yeah.
So that was kind of good stuff too, and great album covers as well. Baker Gurvitz Army with the illustration, right? So this is one of those bands that they almost seem like a band that thought maybe heavy metal was a little gauche and uncool, and we're just going to be kind of a more thoughtful version of that, and they put together very competent records.
Yeah, that's an inspired choice. I would say that these albums are highly underrated. If you've never heard them or the Baker Gurvitz Army albums, I think they're all really, really strong. And they're a little on the artsy side, I think. They try very hard to inject something different into their otherwise heavy music. And I will say, man, he's a really good guitar player. Really good guitar. And didn't he was like the producer and arranger for Madonna for many years? Like he became like a well-known producer, if I remember correctly. Cool. It's like, yeah. He certainly wasn't making any money doing this, Martin, right? So
yeah, for sure. Yeah.
All right. So for my next choice, in keeping with the kind of chronological ness of this, we're going to go to 1972, and I'm going to move over to Germany for a band that only released 1 album, and apparently a guy named Michael Ackerfeld from a band called Opeth. Maybe you've heard of them, Martin. He was so enamored with this band that he said, you know what, I think I'm going to name one of my albums after this particular band. The band is Blackwater Park. The album is Dirtbox, again from 1972. Here are the guys in the band. Very German sounding stuff, but very, very raw and heavy. 4-piece band, 2 guitar players, bass and drums. With some Hammond organ in spots, which I think adds that kind of little, Deep Purple thing from time to time, as well as like maybe Atomic Rooster and Vanilla Fudge and, Iron Butterfly and all that. But man, wailing guitars everywhere you turn. And I would say at the core of this music is just really, really energetic and amped up from a gain perspective of blues rock. And it riffs everywhere you turn. Mental Block is just a killer song. Roundabout's another really great song on here. Vocals are in English throughout, but they're really well done. Not a lot of accent on the vocals, which is really good. But the drums are really good. You get One's Life is another good one. Indian Summer is metallic as all hell, kicks all sorts of ass. The drumming is really good throughout the album. And again, if you love kind of screaming lead guitar work in really aggressive, heavy, metallic blues-based songs, that's what you kind of get here. You even get a little bit of boogie on here as well. Dirty Face is one of those tracks, and Rock Song is another early kind of proto-metal classic that's not that far removed from what the Scorpions were doing right around the same time. So all in all, it's one really, really heavy album. And again, for 1971 or 1972, sorry, a band that nobody ever talks about, but obviously the guy in Opeth was a fan. So that's, in fact, they're probably more well known for that than anything else, because nobody was buying this back in the day. But Mr. Ackerfeld kind of put them on the map. So
pretty crap album cover too. Eh?
Oh, it's all it's terrible. This awful. I mean, hold on, let me take it out of the thing. Yeah, this got awful. Let me show you the whole thing here. Like, so basically that's supposed to be like an apartment building, a high rise, and it's so hot on the roof that you could fry eggs on the roof. There you got your toilet, and what is this? I don't even know what the hell the rest of this sink. So, it's bizarre. Bizarre.
Funny, yeah. 7 songs, kind of purpley, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's very to the point and very concise, and I love this. And this is and they do a really interesting cover of the Beatles for No One, which is pretty good, pretty rocking. But yeah, I only just discovered this like a handful of years ago. I had never heard of these guys before. And then, the more you get into the weeds with Opeth, you find out that he actually named a lot of songs and albums after really obscure bands from the 70s, right? So then you start going down that rabbit hole. It's just like, it's crazy.
Yeah. Okay, so my next choice, very similar, actually. I went with Night, Sun, Morning. That's one that everybody sort of talks about. And it's funny, I'm looking on my other computer here. So this list of the heaviest obscurities. I had this rated number 3 as the heaviest obscurities. And the thing with my heaviest obscurities list is it's all of the 70s. So what did I have at the very top? I had my favorite, there we go, a better album cover too. So I had Ram Jam, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Ram first, and then Heavy Load, Full Speed at High Level second. Looking like real rockers. And then I had Night, Sun, Morning. So it's the first old album. And then I had Legs Diamond. A diamond is a hard rock. So I had I think it's 78, 79, 72, 77. And then I had Marseille, which is probably 79. And then I had Legs Diamond, which is also 77, Buffalo. So here it is competing with albums from way up into the late 70s in terms of heaviness. Just quote a little bit here. So they were on Zebra. Night Sun were a Mannheim band, also part of the scene, Kin Ping May and 26-6 and then. That saw One Fierce and Vaulted Connie Plank produced. So this is the famous Connie Plank, right? Who I think we just lost recently, right? Produced Record Before Dawn, Erased the Inky Blackness. Bruno Shab ended up in Guru Guru, but that's about it. Morning is Pounding, Charmingly Frantic, Note Dance cross between Deep Purple, Uriah Heep, Black Sabbath, and the darkest, most appealing tracks of German hard prog. Slammers like Got a Bone of My Own, Slush Pan Man, and Living with the Dying, right? Living with the Dying, we've got Scorpions with Living and Dying, right? Combining sinister structure and eviscerating Hammond keyboard work and car crunching riffs that cloak the mind. And so this is literally pretty much relentless throughout for one of these, but it still is relentless in that Deep Purple Mark I sort of annoying, depressing Hammond organ, a lot of playing, Iron Butterfly way, right? Iron Butterfly's got some pretty heavy stuff too. I think the Ball record is pretty heavy, right?
Yeah, there's some good rocking stuff on there.
Yeah. But what else did I say? You're giving me eerie, mesmerizing melodies, the acoustic, basically warlike beyond death walks behind you from start to finish. Morning further distinguishes itself through the fact that all the songs differ from each other vastly in speed and invention of the many breaks and licks and flourishes and about faces throughout. So absolutely fits right in there with that whole German narrative where most of these bands are not very Sabbath influenced. They're more heavy psych influenced. And it's a little bit like that whole thing where punk goes into hardcore, where punk got really artsy and a bunch of guys said, wait a minute, where'd all the heaviness go? So I think when you get the evolution of psych, you get the same sort of thing where these bands go, all right, well, the last part of Psych, they didn't know Psych was going to be blown up and end soon, but they basically decided that let's make the most extreme because all musical genres kind of get more extreme over time. They basically said, let's make the most extreme version of psych. Little did they know it was a dated genre by this time, and it was basically going to go the way of the dodo sort of thing. But in its final throes, in this European phase of its final throes, it's as extreme and as heavy as it was ever going to get.
Yeah, exactly. And this album is noteworthy too for this like 2 tracks, if I remember correctly. Maybe it's just one where there's like this screaming, like John Coltrane inspired saxophone that just comes out of nowhere in the midst of all this kind of like heavy riffing. It's like, what is going on here? And it's so like kind of like free jazz and crazy. Like it almost like it doesn't fit, but it's all the more intriguing just because they plopped it in there, right?
Yeah,
Which is really interesting. Yeah, it's a very heavy album. I like this quite a bit. That's another good choice. All right, I'm going to stay in 1972 here for a British band that basically morphed out of what many consider the classic lineup of Atomic Rooster. So the band is called Hard Stuff. The album is Bulletproof. And this actually, so here we have John Ducan or John Can. I never did. His name is pronounced both ways, no matter where you look, on guitar and vocals. And you got Paul Hammond, drummer, also from Atomic Rooster. So they left Atomic Rooster after the Death Walks the album after Death Walks Behind You. And then on bass you have John Gustafson, who was from Quatermass, right? So you have these 3 guys, and then vocalist Harry Shaw, who was never credited on the album, and he kind of was already jettisoned from the band by the time the album came out. I'll go into a little bit of history in a second, but these guys, impressed enough people at the time that, Purple Records, Deep Purple's record label, signed them actually. So this came out on a somewhat of a notable label at the time, and it's pretty rocking stuff. I think if you like the Atomic Rooster albums that came out before these guys put this band together, it's very similar, just minus the Hammond organ. Maybe not as complicated, because Atomic Rooster has this kind of little prog side to them that these guys really don't. But you get songs like No Witch at All, which is big and metallic. There's a couple tracks on here that have like kind of like a heavy boogie feel, like classic Foghat. Time Gambler is great. Millionaire is another good one. Monster in Paradise, all cranking songs. But this is, one of those bands where they have a really complicated history. So they on tour, they wound up getting into a car crash that was pretty bad. And while they were on tour, they were still putting like the finishing touches on their follow-up album. So after the car crash, the band just never was the same again. They wound up releasing their second album, Botox Dementia, which ironically enough is not nearly as heavy as this one. And then basically that was it. The band split up. They went their separate ways. And John Ducan actually wound up filling in for Thin Lizzy for a spell, like a couple of weeks. So he's part of the whole Thin Lizzy story, even though never recorded with them or anything like that. But before this came out, the band actually recorded a good chunk of this album in demo form with that guy, Harry Shaw, on vocals. And that's actually now available on this compilation from Angel Air Records, which came out a bunch of years ago when they were calling themselves Bullet. So before they got signed to Purple Records and changed their name to Hard Stuff, they were called Bullet. And this is called The Entrance to Hell. So, but here's the funny thing. So originally on this album cover, that Harry Shaw singer was supposed to be down here, his picture. So because they booted him from the band before the album came out, they had already taken the pictures and everything like that. So they basically took him out of the picture and didn't credit him on the album at all. So here, when they released this compilation later on, he actually sings on most of this album, but once again, he's nowhere to be found in any of the pictures. So this guy, Harry Shaw, got the complete shaft from these guys, but pretty heavy stuff, pretty dark stuff. I think if you like the heavier, heavier work of Atomic Rooster, there are some Sabbathy things going on here, but it's not quite as lumbering and, riff heavy, but really energetic, great guitar work. Vocals are pretty good. I mean, on this album, all 3 guys, actually the 2 guys Gustafson and Can sing most of the tracks on here, but there are a couple of songs where they do feature Harry Shaw on vocals. But really good stuff, and 2 albums and basically done.
Yeah, I think the follow-up is Bollocks Dementia, isn't it? I believe, and it's not as heavy.
Bolex Dementia, Botox Dementia. I forget what the actual title of it is.
Yeah, and that was 73. So so 72 and 73. I think that record is the best out of all 10 on our lists, in terms of, it's similar in quality to Three Man Army. It also reminds me a little bit of the later Buffalo records, which are way better than the earlier, much lauded Buffalo records.
Yeah, true.
There's like, after the first two Buffalo records, there's, I think, two more: Only Want You for Your Body and something else. Really weird album cover. But those are actually really good and really kind of competent and capable and well recorded sort of things. But yeah, it's pretty cool. Sinister Minister and all that, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think this is probably the best album on both of our lists. So
yeah,
okay, so
stuff.
my last one. So my last one here is very similar. So very similar to the Harry Chapter and to the Night Sun Morning. I'm going with Birth Control, Hoodoo Man. CBS.
I'll go grab it, Martin. Hold on.
Yeah, all right. So yeah, crazy album cover. It's funny, when I wasn't paying much attention to these things or just flipping through them in the racks.
We can't not show this. I had to go grab.
Yeah, it reminds me of May Blitz, right? The album cover to May Blitz.
Yeah.
And also, I used to flipping through the racks as a kid. I used to get these guys confused with Bertha. So we've got Birth Control and we've got Bertha, right? The female, precursor band of Fanny, right? Kind of thing. Yeah. And again, so this is basically a slightly riffier. So you're moving 72. You are moving a little bit more away from the straight psych stuff. I'll just quote a little bit here. Hoodoo Man is the long-running German outfit's third album. Riffy, delicious, deep purple knockoff, sort of like a dated version of Machine Head, all richly recorded, played with plum, alchemy between guitars and Hammonds and full Frostfire. If not for the elongated tracks, which necessarily rock a reek of both prog and psych, Hoodoo Man would be a masterpiece of this style, every bit as good as Death Walks Behind You. So here I am comparing everything. Atomic Rooster, Death Walks Behind You. I gave it a 7 for heaviness and a 9 for merit, and I had it number 51 in terms of the heaviness for all of the 70s. So that's pretty high up there. What else we got here? You almost forgot the fact that the album contains 5 long tracks and a short jig of an afterthought. The ideas and events come rapidly and relentlessly. See Vandergraphic traffic of the title track, and the sinister acts and keys melds freak you out impressively and depressively. So here, even back then when I was writing about this, is like how this stuff depresses me because it's very dated sounding. So essentially, as I say, I guess a dated version of Machine Head. And yeah, the other albums, this is the best of them. But yeah, it's again, this whole German thing of being mainland European, and you can kind of tell, sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm glad you picked this, because I'm a big fan of Birth Control, and I find most of their early to mid 70s albums really good. They're all really different from each other. I think their second album, Operation, which came out right before this, I think is similar in style to this, but this one's heavier. And then they did a couple pretty straightforward prog albums, and then they dabbled in disco and funk for a little bit. It's just bizarre. Their late 70s albums are just really, really weird. But yeah, this generally is my favorite. This is really good. This and fairly notorious. And again, I've heard this in different places. I haven't heard the guy himself say it, but apparently Kai Hansen from Halloween was a big fan of this band. That's why he named his band Gamma Ray again. So I don't know.
Yes, I had a note about that in my review. So I obviously heard that somewhere as well.
Yeah.
And Kai Hansen's crew also covering the song for use as a B-side. So I guess they even covered the song. Right?
Yeah. So pretty cool. Yeah, good, really good album. Really good album. All right. So my last choice for today, and only pick from the US of A, is an album that came out in 1973. This was signed to RCA Records. Band is from Cleveland, Ohio. Ranicus. Self-titled. All right. So this is I think out of all of my picks, this one is a bit different than the others. So here you have 2 guitar players on this album, plus the singer also played a little bit of guitar as well, so technically 3 of them. You have the high-pitched vocals of Woody LaFell, who Doesn't sound all that much different from Geddy Lee. Maybe not quite as histrionic. Or it kind of also sounds a little bit like the guy from Pavlov's Dog. Maybe not quite that high, but in that kind of style. And here you have blues rock, certainly lots of prog here, certainly psych and early metal. This is less about like big riffy type songs, but more like that kind of twin guitar attack thing, and utilizing all those other elements here. You got You're in America, which opens up the album, which is really fast paced, a lot of riffs going all over the place. The screaming vocals, the screaming lead guitars, that whole thing. You got Bad Talk is kind of more of a headbanger on here. But again, the twin guitars are everywhere on this album. So if you like that sort of thing, I think you'll really like this. You have like a prog song on here called Twilight, which has loads of mellotron, right? So there's that. Prayer is the big long song on here, 11 minutes long. That's mostly prog and psych and some hard rock. Cleveland, Ohio is another hard rocker. The song called Nightmare, again, shows their kind of weird, it almost sounds like blood rock, like DOA era blood rock, kind of that sort of thing. But fairly heavy album, maybe not as crushingly heavy as some of these other ones, but I think the musicality of this one is really off the charts. It's kind of an obscure classic. They would break up after the debut. Then many years later, they released an unreleased album they were working on from 1974 called Thieves, Liars, and Traitors, which I have as well. That's pretty good. Not quite as good as this. And then in 2016, they reunited. They recorded an album called Granicus 3, Better Days. I haven't heard that one, so I can't really comment on it. But this one is very, very cool. I always kind of like that album cover too. It's kind of mysterious looking, right? Here's this, it's kind of a live shot, right? Everybody's in shadow, which is pretty neat. So yeah, really, really good one if you haven't heard it. Granicus from Cleveland, Ohio.
Yeah, definitely distinguished by those high vocals.
Yeah.
And the high vocals, I would frame it a little more straightforward and not obscure like a Geddy Lee or a Pavlov's Dog. It's just good vocals, good high vocals, right? It's not terribly novelty-ish, I guess, is what I'm trying.
Yeah, it's not as over the top. I would kind of, the singer from Bang, I think, is also kind of falls in the similar wheelhouse, right? They're high, but they're not that high, right?
Yeah. And good production, kind of stoner rocky, good playing as well. Stoner rock, desert rock album cover, right?
Yeah. Oh, 100%. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah, it looks like just something out of Sweden, in 1996, right?
Yeah.
That album cover,
I dig this a lot. This is really cool. I actually, when we were talking about doing this, and I was going to pick my 5, I knew I wanted to talk about this one, but I hadn't heard it in a while. So I was listening to it at the gym the other day. I'm like, wow, this is quite good. It's always nice when you have these like obscure albums that you own, but you don't listen to them all the time. And then when you do pull them out after like a couple of years or whatever, you're like, wow, it's like, why was this not more well known, right? Some of this you understand why it was obscure, but still, that's a really good one. Very musical and a lot of variety in that album too, which is kind of cool.
And you notice, like, okay, so it's 1973. There's lots of metal out by this point. America, we've talked about how America was a little bit frumpy and behind the times. But now we're getting, there's lots of precedents now, and so even a baby band, who's on their first record sort of thing can be fairly professional sounding, but it's no Montrose from the same year, that's for sure. And it's still American. It's almost like an improved version of Mountain and Cactus, like the next step forward, but still on that not impressive trajectory sort of thing, where it's not super modern yet. But Sabbath's already up to 5 albums by this point.
Oh,
right?
For sure. Yeah. And the
golden period's all over with now.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And this one's interesting because I think with most of the other albums we talked about today, we can kind of maybe detect what their influences might have been. I'm not 100% sure I know exactly where these guys were coming from. This is different. This is very different. And it's nothing is overly obvious. There's no Sabbath anything going on this album. You could maybe argue that there's some Wishbone Ash happening on this album. This is, before Thin Lizzy, really broke. So you can't really talk about that. So I don't know. I don't know. It's you can't cite Rush. You can't. There's a lot of bands that you would have thought maybe they were influenced by, but they actually came before a lot of them. So I don't know. It's a very cool album.
Yeah, Cool. Yeah, just a couple of quick honorable mentions. So I may get some of this wrong here, but I'm looking at my list in terms of not remembering what years they came out, but in terms of early stuff. So if we wanted to stay 72 or earlier, I suppose, I had on my list of again, what is this list? Appendix 4, the heaviest 100 obscurities. So this has nothing to do with merit, right? This is just how heavy are these things, doing that old mathematical heaviness thing. So I had on here the first Lucifer's Friend.
Yeah.
I had Death Walks Behind You. Let's see. Bang Bang, Electric Food Flash. I had at number 20.
That's a good one.
Evidently
Yeah.
fairly heavy. Sir Lord Baltimore Kingdom Come has to be up here pretty high. The Buffalo Volcanic Rock has to be pretty high. Mass Slaughterhouse, I don't remember what year that's from. Yeah, these are all late. Teaser, Truth and Janie is late. The Raw Kicks album, yeah, it's a pretty bizarre one to have on there. A lot of people don't know that one. Ultra, Warhorse, War Pig, Finch, Thunderbird. That might be a little later, that one as well. Yeah, I don't even remember half of these. Downtrip, if you don't rock now. The first Blood Rock I had on here. There's the 3-Man Army showing up at number 47. Ready Teddy, I know that's a later one. Neon Roses later. There's the Birth Control showing up. Electric Food. Yeah, there's the Toad. Survivor, All Your Pretty Moves. Don't remember what that's from, what year. Tiger Rock, I remember getting Tiger B. Smith, Tiger Rock as a kid. That was a funny one. Suck, Time to Suck. I think that's the South African band that covered Sabbath in like 1971.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's crazy, right? There's Toad, Tomorrow Blue, Oda, Savage Grace 2. There's the Granicus showing up. Yeah, so there's a pile of these, right? And as they get further down, they're not as heavy, sort of thing. But all of us, all those record collector guys at the record shows and stuff are just always salivating over these albums, right? Because you're always looking for anything heavy from the old days, right? Yeah. And I always forget that as a kid, like even in the late 70s, when I'm like raving about some album to somebody, like The Boys, Too Wild to Tame or something. It's like people will play it and go, oh, what's the big deal? And, I always have to say, you don't understand. There wasn't that much heavy to buy, right? So
that's very true. It's very true. So now when all this stuff is popping up and coming out of the woodworks, where people just want to snack it all up and grab it. And I think it's pretty cool. I personally, I'm a big fan of this type of stuff. So I get all giddy when, you hear of something that, was recorded that was never released, that all of a sudden is, like Rise Above Relics is a great label for unearthing this stuff from the vault. Anytime they have something new come out and they don't release too many new things, I snatch those up immediately. And some of them are not that good, but there's kind of like this aura about these mysterious heavy bands from the early 70s that, I can't get enough of. So I'm a sucker for all of it. I'm a total sucker. So anyway, Martin, what's new going on with get any new podcasts or contrarians or books coming out?
Yeah, so the podcast, History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff, I've got my 200th episode coming up. And for that, I'm going to do a little bit of a special show. Not that special, but I'm just going to go through like what got me into being a fan in the first place, which I've talked about in various places, but I'll do it in a lot of detail there. So yeah, I'll do that. And then Contrarians, we just did a Dark Horse album on Rolling Stone's Black and Blue. That'll go up soon. Yeah, I did my Metallica review. You did your Metallica review. And yeah, the books are all at martinpopoff.com.
There you go. So Martin just alluded to the Metallica review. So stay tuned next week where Martin and I will kind of be talking about not necessarily just the Metallica album, but this whole idea of like long albums and long songs. And we'll probably be mentioning 72 Seasons and the most recent Iron Maiden album, Senjutsu, and just kind of talking about this whole idea of when is an album too long? Why do some of us think that, a 70-minute album is too long? Why, some people perhaps think that more music is better? Why wouldn't we like longer albums, right? So, Martin, I don't know if you want to hint any more of what we're talking about next week, or should we just leave it at that?
I think we should probably just leave it at that because we'll just go on forever. We'll do the whole show right now. So
And just so you guys know that generally that's what happens anyway when we stop recording these things. So we start talking about, we did this last week, right? We basically talked about the whole show before we even recorded it. So, but yeah, so that's coming up next week. So this whole concept of long albums, long songs, the pros and cons, and all that sort of thing. So that's coming up next week. So what do we got happening this weekend here on the channel here? Tomorrow, stay tuned for the UK Connection, where we will be talking about our favorite and least favorite Accept albums, the great German band from. Great German fan from Germany. Yes, the great German band Accepts. God, it's early in the morning. And then on Sunday, Chris Allo and I will be ranking the albums of Danzig. So lots of fun stuff happening for you here this weekend. And we'll see you all on Monday as well on the Hudson Valley Square. So till next Friday, for Martin Popoff, I am Pete Pardo. Visit us on the web at www.seatranquility.org. We're on Facebook. We're on YouTube all together all the damn time. Please subscribe if you haven't already and click on that notification bell so you get alert of all of our content as it posts. And please do hit the like button before you leave. So thanks for watching, everybody. See you next week on the Funhouse. Have a good weekend. Take care.